I was in my early teens during the Russian Civil War. I lived in a small town that changed hands many times. When it was occupied by the White Army, I almost longed for the return of the Red Army, and vice versa. There was not much difference between them in practice, but there was in theory. The Red Army stood for totalitarian dictatorship and rule by terror. The White Army stood for nothing. Repeat, nothing. In answer to the monstrous evil they were fighting, the whites found nothing better to proclaim than the dustiest, smelliest bromides of the time. We must fight, they said, for Holy Mother Russia, for faith and tradition. I wondered, even in those years, which is morally worse, evil or the appeasement of evil, the cowardly evasion that leaves an evil unnamed, unanswered, and unchallenged. I was inclined to think that the second is worse, because it makes the first possible. I am certain of it today. But in the years of my adolescence, I did not know how rare a virtue the non-evasion of reality actually is. So I kept waiting for some person or group among the whites to come out with a real political manifesto that would explain and proclaim why one must fight against communism and what one might fight for. I knew even then that the what was individual rights. I knew that man is not a slave of the state. I knew that man's right to his own life, and therefore to freedom, has to be upheld with as great and proud a sense of moral righteousness as any idea could ever deserve. I knew that nothing less would do, and that without such a stand, the anti-Reds were doomed. But I thought this was self-evident, that the whole civilized world knew it, and that there surely existed some minds able to communicate this knowledge to Russia, which was perishing for lack of it. I waited through the years of the Civil War. Nothing resembling that manifesto was ever uttered by anyone. In a passive, indifferent way, the majority of the Russian people were behind the White Army. They were not for the whites, but merely against the Reds. They feared the Reds' atrocities. I knew that the Reds' deepest atrocity was intellectual, that the thing which had to be fought and defeated was their ideas. But no one answered them. The country's passivity turned to hopeless lethargy as people gave up. The Reds had an incentive, the promise of nationwide looting. They had the leadership and the semi-discipline of a criminal gang. They had an allegedly intellectual program and an allegedly moral justification. The whites had icons. The Reds won. I learned a great deal in the years since. I learned that the concept of individual rights is far, far from self-evident, that most of the world does not grasp it, that the United States grasped it only for a brief historical moment and is now in the process of losing the memory. The hardest thing to learn, the most difficult one to believe, was the fact that the so-called political rightists in this country, the alleged defenders of freedom, i.e. of capitalism, were as vague, as empty, and as futile as the leaders of the White Army. More shamefully so, since they had a much, much greater knowledge to evade. For years, the intellectual posture of America's political leaders has been a long, pleading, appeasing, self-abasing whine of apology for this country's greatness, an apology addressed to every advocate or perpetrator of collectivism's horrors and failures anywhere on earth. I did not want, intend, or expect to be the only philosophical defender of man's rights in the country of man's rights, but if I am, I am. And if I am giving you the kind of intellectual ammunition and inspiration I had so desperately waited to hear in my youth, I'm glad. I can say that I know how you feel.